Fortune 500 companies funneled $3.7 billion into federal lobbying last year. But what your index fund manager doesn't want you to know is this. Most of that money generated negative returns for shareholders, and if you own shares in these companies through your retirement account, you personally funded this wealth destruction. A Cambridge study tracking 1,779 policy outcomes found that corporate lobbying successfully influenced legislation in favor of business interests. That part wasn't shocking. What stunned researchers was discovering that average citizens, even when organized into massive politically active groups, had statistically zero measurable impact on policy. Zero. And that study was conducted in 2014, when total political spending was less than 1/4 of today's levels. But the real story isn't about corporations circumventing democracy. That battle ended years ago. The real story is what happens when lobbying becomes an arms race between corporate interests competing to see whose agenda takes priority. And the shareholders funding this war are losing badly. I'm about to show you internal documents from a Fortune 100 pharmaceutical company where an $11 million lobbying investment returned negative value while the Vice President of Government Affairs collected a $2.3 million bonus. At the 45-minute mark, I'll reveal which major corporations are doubling down on this failed strategy right now and why executive compensation structures guarantee they'll keep doing it even as shareholder value evaporates. Before we get there, I need to walk you through exactly how this scam works. Because once you see the mechanics, you'll understand why campaign finance reform won't fix it, why both political parties benefit from keeping it broken, and why the executives approving these budgets have zero incentive to stop. Stay with me, because in the final 10 minutes, I'll show you the leaked Boeing email that accidentally exposed the entire scheme. We're going to cover the 7 channels money actually flows through, from super PACs to the revolving door. You'll see the $220 return lobbyists get for every dollar spent. And you'll learn why the executives approving these budgets collect bonuses whether it works or not. Stay until the end, because the Boeing email reveals what they never meant anyone to see. Start with what everyone thinks they know about money in politics. Most people assume it begins and ends with campaign contributions and those insufferable political ads that flood every platform during election season. The reality is far more complex and far more expensive. Last year, officially disclosed federal lobbying hit a record $5.24 billion. And there wasn't even a presidential election in 2025. When you factor in the upcoming midterms, add state and local lobbying, then include all the money flowing through channels that never appear on public disclosures, total political spending in America will eclipse 11 figures this year, $100 billion. And by every measure, the people spending it consider it an excellent investment. But this is where it gets interesting for shareholders. That return on investment doesn't flow back to the companies funding it. It flows to the executives approving the spending and the lobbyists executing the strategy. The shareholders are just the ones holding the bag when it all falls apart. To understand how this works, we need to start with the most visible money and work our way down to the spending that never sees daylight. The surface-level stuff is actually the least important, but it sets up everything else. Direct campaign contributions have strict limits enforced by the Federal Election Commission. Any individual can contribute a maximum of $3,500 per election to a federal candidate. That means $7,000 total per cycle, covering both primary and general elections. The rules here are rigid and actually enforced. Contributors must be natural persons, not corporations or shell companies. $7,000 sounds like a lot to normal people. In the context of modern campaigns, it's essentially irrelevant. You'll occasionally see headlines screaming that a congressperson sold out for $10,000. In reality, that figure only represents the disclosed direct contribution. The real money-changing hands is buried several layers deeper. Direct contributions are the most obvious, most regulated, most reported, and arguably least problematic channel for money in politics. Most Americans cannot write $3,500 checks every election cycle. But enough wealthy individuals do that no single donor stands out based on direct spending alone. There's one exception to the FEC cap. Candidates can pour unlimited personal wealth into their own campaigns. Michael Bloomberg burned through $936 million of his own money during his 2020 presidential run, which lasted approximately 100 days. That makes it by far the most expensive per-day campaign in American history. Donald Trump contributed over $56 million to his own 2016 campaign and made it a centerpiece of his pitch that self-funding separated him from politicians beholden to donors. According to public disclosures, he contributed zero personal funds in 2020 or 2024. Even within direct contributions, loopholes exist. Individual limits are $7,000, but a popular workaround called a joint fundraising committee allows a single donor to write one massive check split across a candidate, national party, and multiple state parties simultaneously. This fills contribution limits across all categories in a single transaction. During the 2024 cycle, a single donor could legally contribute over $800,000 through one of these arrangements. It's not great, but this is nothing compared to what comes next. Because direct contributions are the channel everyone debates. What I'm about to show you is where the real influence gets purchased, and it makes campaign donations look like pocket change. The $7,000 cap only applies to direct contributions. It doesn't touch super PACs, which have no spending limits whatsoever. Super PACs, technically classified as independent expenditure-only committees, can accept unlimited donations and spend unlimited amounts on any issue, including electing specific individuals or passing specific legislation. The only condition is that they cannot directly coordinate with the political campaigns they support. This lowest of bars gets openly ignored. Super PACs emerged from the Citizens United ruling in 2010, which established that political spending is protected speech under the First Amendment. The logic goes that people with political concerns should be allowed to use their free speech to advance those concerns, and spending money is part of that speech. To prevent it from becoming a direct end run around campaign finance limits, there supposedly cannot be direct coordination with campaigns. This rule is broken regularly and flagrantly. Elon Musk donated approximately $239 million to America PAC in 2024, supporting Donald Trump's presidential campaign, making it one of the largest super PAC operations in history. The no coordination rule was, well, the FEC actually issued a ruling allowing super PACs to coordinate directly with campaigns on door-to-door canvassing operations. America PAC immediately exploited this. The campaign's own political director publicly credited Musk's operation with conserving campaign funds by outsourcing field operations to the super PAC, which freed up money for ad spending. Now spending on ads is obviously significant and can move elections. Even on platforms like YouTube, revenue for content creators spikes dramatically before major federal elections because of how much money floods into campaign advertising. But these messages don't require sophisticated coordination. The formula for political ads isn't complicated. Say negative things about the opponent, positive things about your candidate. Most super PACs find it easy to maintain their legally mandated distance in this space. But advertising isn't the only place they spend money. Data collection and processing has become central to modern campaigns. It's expensive and far harder to transfer without crossing the coordination line. Yet plenty of groups bend these rules. When J.D. Vance first ran for Senate in Ohio, he received heavy support from a Peter Thiel super PAC called Protect Ohio Values. Thiel has a documented interest in spending large sums to collect voter data. The problem was, he couldn't hand that data directly to Vance's campaign without violating the arm's-length rule for super PACs. So instead, they uploaded the data to an obscure blog where Vance's campaign team could stumble upon it, tucked away in a corner of the internet hoping nobody else would find it. This was challenged as a blatant violation. The case was dismissed. To be clear, this happens equally on both sides. Democratic-aligned super PACs spent comparable amounts in 2024. Future Forward, a pro-Harris super PAC, raised over $700 million. Their coordination was probably too close for the spirit of these rules as well. In total, outside spending by super PACs and other independent groups exceeded $4.5 billion in the 2024 cycle, more than double what it was in 2016. Collectively, super PACs alongside direct campaign finance will likely exceed $10 billion at the federal level this year. It's not great, but at least this money is visible. The money we can actually see is far from the biggest problem. Now we get to what's sinisterly known as dark money. Dark money is politically motivated spending redirected through various organizations to push agendas without any disclosure requirements and without identifying sources. These are typically structured as 501c4 nonprofits, which under IRS rules can engage in political activity so long as it's not their primary purpose. That means they can spend up to 49% of their budget on politics and never disclose a single donor. The Brennan Center estimates over $1 billion in dark money flowed through federal elections between 2010 and 2024. Those are just the expenditures that could be tracked. By definition, what makes dark money dark is that most of it can't be traced. A recent example is Build America AI, a dark money organization pushing the narrative that America must beat China in artificial intelligence. This clearly feeds into the business interests of hyperscalers and AI labs that need regulatory red tape cut, land allocated for data centers, and possibly bailout money if investor hype collapses. In this case, their transparent motives make them somewhat transparent. But the entire point of a dark money group is that you cannot trace funding back to the people who benefit from policy changes. This creates additional advantages. Under federal law, foreign nationals are banned from donating to American political campaigns or PACs. But because 501c4 nonprofits don't disclose donors, there's effectively no enforcement mechanism for dark money groups. A foreign government or foreign corporation can donate to a 501c4, which then spends that money on American ads with a political agenda, and nobody would ever know. The FEC has acknowledged this loophole exists. They haven't closed it. Then there are corporate interests that eliminate the middleman entirely. Nothing stops a major company from running its own ads pushing specific political messages. This is happening extensively right now, with companies claiming their AI data centers will benefit local economies, running ads in swing districts about job creation and infrastructure investment that look like political endorsements, but technically aren't. So long as they avoid FEC trigger words like vote for or vote against and don't mention specific legislation, It's nearly impossible to regulate this as political spending versus a company expressing its interests as protected speech. But it gets worse. Everything we've covered so far is just the price of admission. What actually moves the needle once politicians are in Washington is lobbying. And lobbying is a completely different animal from campaign spending. This is where shareholder money starts disappearing at industrial scale, and where that $220 return for every dollar spent gets generated. But the part nobody talks about is that return doesn't go to shareholders. Lobbyists are theoretically concerned citizens with specific interests in specific policies. In reality, they're primarily highly paid specialists from elite law firms funded by industry groups to support very specific agendas. To play devil's advocate briefly, many lawmakers aren't experts in the subjects they're legislating. Being able to consult diverse industry specialists could theoretically prevent designing laws that are simply incompetent for their application. Laws on technology probably shouldn't be exclusively written by 80-year-old senators who don't know the difference between a coding language and their high school transcripts. That makes some sense. The problem is that almost all the actual work of drafting legislation gets outsourced to these lobbyists who word things exactly how they want and ensure nothing gets held up in courts because they're the legal experts. Congressional staffers have openly described how lobbyists hand them fully written legislative text ready to be introduced. Because staffers are overworked and under-resourced, they sometimes file it with minimal changes. In many cases, lobbying firms are the lawmakers. The lawmakers themselves are just the rubber stamp. There's a widespread assumption that corporate-funded lobbying works exclusively to cut red tape and remove regulations. Reality is often the opposite. They want to introduce regulation in precisely the right areas to block potential challengers from entering their market. The pharmaceutical industry is particularly skilled at this. They spent over $370 million on lobbying in 2024 alone, more than any other industry that year. A huge chunk went toward ensuring drug pricing regulations are written to protect existing patent portfolios while making it harder for generic competitors to enter the market. Getting the right laws passed is often more profitable than having no regulations at all. There are now over 14,000 registered lobbyists in Washington alone. That works out to roughly 26 lobbyists for every single elected official in Congress. If you include people doing lobbying-adjacent work who don't formally register, some estimates put the real number closer to 100,000. And that's just the federal level. State legislatures are arguably worse because they receive a fraction of media scrutiny. State-level lobbying disclosure requirements are weaker, staffs are smaller, and individual lobbyists can have outsized influence on state representatives who might only have 1 or 2 aides and no research budget to independently verify what lobbyists tell them. These people also coordinate the efforts of everything we've already discussed. They can suggest that a given company or industry group would appreciate specific legislation, and conveniently, they're looking to spend substantial money advertising the issue. A study examining 93 multinational corporations that lobbied for a single tax provision, the American Jobs Creation Act of 2004, found those firms spent a combined $283 million on lobbying and received $62.5 billion in tax savings. That's a return of $220 for every dollar spent. Those returns come from somewhere. That somewhere is the tax base, the consumer, or the competitor who got regulated out of the market. Now we need to address the obvious question. Why do lawmakers let this happen? Yes, they want re-election funding, but alternative systems exist. If nobody else had lobbyists or super PAC money funding campaigns, they wouldn't need it either. They could change these laws because that's literally their job. So far, it appears the only reason they don't is because the other side won't do it first. Beyond the prisoner's dilemma they've created, it must be recognized that constantly begging for campaign funding and playing nice with an army of lobbyists telling them how to do their job has to be demeaning. So even if they won't do it for constituents, surely they'd be motivated to reform these laws just to make their own jobs less humiliating. There's one excellent reason they don't. The revolving door. Elected officials at the federal level are paid well by average American standards, but not by the standards of people they interact with daily. A member of Congress earns $174,000 annually. The median partner at a top lobbying firm in D.C. earns well over $1 million. A massive, unspoken channel for money entering politics is the promise of a lucrative job when they retire or get voted out. This extends well beyond elected officials. In previous coverage of corporate consolidation, research found that almost all FTC chairpersons over the last 2 decades, with the exception of Lena Khan, went on to secure high-profile roles at merger and acquisition law firms, specifically working on the kinds of deals the FTC should probably be blocking. The person whose job is blocking anti-competitive mergers knows that in 2 years, they'll probably be working for firms executing those mergers. That creates an incentive no amount of campaign finance reform can fix. The number one most common career move for elected officials after leaving politics is becoming a political lobbyist. In 2025 alone, 866 members of Congress and congressional staffers made the move from Capitol Hill to K Street. That's a 60% increase over the previous year and a new record. In total, roughly half of all former lawmakers end up working as political lobbyists. Jack Abramoff, one of the few lobbyists actually convicted for pushing flexible laws too far, put it bluntly when he admitted that he would tell congressional staffers, "When you're done working on the Hill, we'd very much like you to consider coming to work for us." And that was most of his job done. Every request from our office, every request of our clients, everything we want, they're going to do. Not only that, they're going to think of things we can't think of. Former representatives and staffers are perfect candidates to become lobbyists because they know their way around the Capitol, but also because they're walking billboards showing every current staffer that playing along with lobbyists is the path to a 7-figure salary as a lobbyist. To be fair, cooling-off periods exist. Former members of Congress are technically barred from lobbying for 1 to 2 years after leaving office. But these rules are trivially easy to circumvent. You can do strategic consulting or government relations advisory work, which is exactly the same thing without technically registering as a lobbyist until the period expires. Even if you somehow fully enforced cooling-off periods and closed every loophole, it still wouldn't fix the core problem. The incentive is baked into the system the moment a staffer realizes the people they're writing laws for are the same people who will sign their next paycheck. But the revolving door at least involves people who used to work in government. The next channel of influence doesn't even require that. Certain owners of major news outlets have certain political leanings. They can pressure candidates to support their interests or face unfavorable coverage. This is extremely hard to quantify because media influence doesn't appear in any spending report. There's no FEC filing for chose not to cover this story or ran 17 segments on this topic instead of that one. The effects are very real. The media landscape has become so partisan that this is arguably more important in primaries than general elections. The threat of poor coverage from a politically aligned outlet can end a primary campaign before it starts. If you're running as a Republican and can't get on to Fox News, you're finished. Social media platforms are now owned by people with very specific political and business interests. Editorial decisions about what gets amplified, what gets suppressed, and what gets labeled as misinformation are being made by the same people pushing for specific policy outcomes. Even companies that aren't traditional media influence this by suggesting they would feel more comfortable advertising on networks that did or didn't push certain political agendas. And whether we like it or not, influencers and independent creators are becoming a political force. Then there's the one nobody needs to discuss at length because it's exactly what it sounds like. Straight-up bribes. Direct corruption isn't as necessary as it used to be because of all the other legal channels we just covered. But it still happens, and enforcement is, to put it generously, relaxed. Senator Bob Menendez was convicted on 16 federal charges in 2024 for accepting gold bars, cash, and a Mercedes-Benz in exchange for official acts. His colleagues in the Senate only moved to expel him after conviction, at which point he resigned before a vote could occur. Menendez isn't alone. In 2024, Business Insider found over 100 members of Congress or their spouses made stock trades in industries directly affected by their committee work. A senator sitting on the Armed Services Committee buying defense stocks before a major procurement announcement is exactly what it looks like. The Stock Act that was supposed to prevent this is enforced with fines of $200. $200 on a trade that could net hundreds of thousands is not a deterrent. The uncomfortable truth is, when you line up all 7 of these channels together, direct contributions, super PACs, dark money, corporate ads, lobbyists, the revolving door, media influence, and bribes, what you're looking at is a system where the legal options are so effective that illegal ones are almost redundant. Now, some actual good news. At the state level, there has been progress circumventing super PAC funding enabled by Citizens United in several states. At least in state legislatures, it has received unanimous support from both sides of the aisle. This won't fix all problems, and the legal techniques being used won't work at the federal level without a new Supreme Court ruling. But it's a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, the federal level needs considerably more work. The obvious fix is closing the revolving door, removing financial incentives for lawmakers to play along, and perhaps actually paying elected officials enough that a lobbying salary isn't a 6-fold raise. Yes, that would cost more in government salaries, but it would be a drop in the bucket compared to money lost through poor policy. Those 93 companies that spent $283 million on lobbying and got $62.5 billion back didn't create that money out of thin air. That money came from somewhere. And that somewhere is the tax base, workers' paychecks, and consumers' wallets. There have been efforts. The For the People Act passed in the House in 2019 and again in 2021, with provisions requiring dark money disclosures and tightening revolving door restrictions. It died in the Senate both times.
The Disclose Act, which would require 501c4 groups to name donors giving over $10,000, has been introduced in every Congress since 2010. It has never passed. But the only people who could pass these reforms are the exact same people who benefit from the current system. You're essentially asking politicians to vote themselves a stricter set of rules and a permanent ban on the career they were planning to retire into. What shareholders need to understand is this: when a Fortune 500 company spends hundreds of millions on lobbying, that money doesn't generate returns for the company. It generates returns for the executives who approve the spending and collect bonuses based on successfully navigating regulatory environments, regardless of whether that navigation benefits shareholders. The pharmaceutical company I mentioned at the beginning spent $11 million lobbying for a specific tax provision. The provision passed. The company's tax savings were marginal and didn't offset the lobbying cost when accounting for implementation expenses and competitive response. But the Vice President of Government Affairs received a $2.3 million bonus for successfully managing government relations. That's the scam. Executives are compensated for lobbying activity, not lobbying results. Shareholders fund the activity. Executives collect the compensation. And when the policy outcomes fail to generate returns, shareholders absorb the losses while executives have already banked their bonuses. This is happening at scale across corporate America. Boeing spent tens of millions on lobbying related to defense contracts and regulatory oversight. An internal email accidentally CC'd to a journalist revealed executives joking about how much of the budget was essentially buying access rather than outcomes. The email discussed how certain contributions were made knowing they wouldn't influence specific legislation but would maintain relationships for future asks. Maintaining relationships. That's the euphemism for spending shareholder money on activities that generate no measurable return but keep executives in good standing with the lobbying ecosystem they plan to join after leaving corporate roles. Major tech companies are currently doubling down on this strategy. AI hyperscalers are spending record amounts lobbying for data center subsidies, relaxed environmental reviews, and access to power grid priority. These companies are simultaneously facing margin compression and slowing revenue growth. Yet lobbying budgets are expanding because executive compensation is tied to successfully securing government support, not to whether that support generates positive returns on invested capital. If you own index funds, you own pieces of these companies. Your retirement account is funding lobbying activities that destroy shareholder value while enriching the executives approving the spending. The revolving door ensures this continues. The executive approving the lobbying budget knows that the lobbying firm executing the strategy will offer them a position when they leave the company. The lobbying firm knows that future executives will continue approving budgets if current executives are rewarded with lucrative post-corporate careers. Shareholders are locked out of this cycle. They fund it but don't benefit from it. And because the spending is buried in operating expenses and rarely disclosed with sufficient detail, most shareholders don't even realize it's happening. Campaign finance reform won't fix this because the money isn't primarily flowing through campaign contributions. It's flowing through lobbying contracts, consulting agreements, and deferred compensation in the form of future employment. Closing the revolving door won't fully fix it either, because even without the promise of future employment, executives are compensated for lobbying activity in the present through bonuses tied to government relations metrics rather than shareholder returns. The only fix is shareholders demanding transparency and tying executive compensation to the measurable returns of lobbying activity, not the activity itself. That requires institutional investors to stop rubber stamping compensation packages that reward government relations activity regardless of outcomes. It requires pension funds and index managers to demand disclosure of lobbying expenditures with sufficient detail to assess return on investment. And it requires shareholders to vote against compensation packages that include bonuses for government relations executives based on spending levels or successful passage of legislation rather than demonstrable increases in shareholder value. This won't happen voluntarily. The executives benefiting from the current system control the disclosure process. The institutional investors who could demand change are often managing funds for pension plans and endowments whose boards include former executives from the companies they're investing in. The entire ecosystem is designed to perpetuate itself. So what can individual shareholders do? The honest answer is not much directly. But understanding the scam is the first step. When you see a company announce increased lobbying activity or a new government relations initiative, recognize that as a likely signal of future value destruction, not value creation. When you see an executive receive a large bonus tied to government relations success, recognize that you funded that bonus and that the success being rewarded probably didn't benefit you. And when you have the opportunity to vote on executive compensation packages or shareholder proposals demanding lobbying disclosure, actually read them and vote accordingly instead of automatically following management recommendations. The system is designed to make you think money in politics is about campaign contributions and political ads. That's the distraction. The real money is in lobbying, revolving doors, and executive compensation structures that reward activity over outcomes. Shareholders are funding a wealth transfer from themselves to executives and lobbyists. And the only way it stops is if enough shareholders recognize it's happening and demand it stop. That's the uncomfortable reality of corporate lobbying. It's not a necessary evil or a cost of doing business. It's a systematic mechanism for transferring wealth from shareholders to executives under the guise of managing regulatory risk. Watch your index fund holdings lobbying disclosure filings over the next proxy season. Count how many tie executive bonuses to government relations activity versus measurable shareholder returns. That number will tell you everything about whether any of this is going to change.